Greetings to you all. I like to think of Insight Myanmar podcast as a community platform. This community includes everyone behind the production, as well as the incredible guests that we welcome on, and it also encompasses the tens of thousands of listeners, like yourself, tuning in from all parts of the world. In essence, this production is a conversation that really we're all part of. So whether we're the ones who happen to be talking, listening, asking questions, or just reflecting, we hope that this community feel can foster deeper understanding, shared learning, and meaningful connections, all centered around the stories and experiences of our guests. And that begins with the conversation coming up now. So thank you for joining us for what's ahead.
And welcome back. We're taking a little bit of a detour today from our usual doom and gloom and negativity regarding the cold hard technicalities of the Myanmar crisis for something a little bit more personable and a little bit more optimistic. I'm joined today by Amy, who's managed to maintain a connection to her Myanmar heritage through, I believe it's 4 generations, and her daughter Lucy has actually, at a very young age, independently chosen to go on out and do activism work and try to raise money to help the people affected in Myanmar. And we're going to be exploring that today and exploring the very concept of identity and how it can be preserved and connected with. But before we get into the weeds, Amy, thank you very much for coming on and sharing your story and sharing Lucy's story. And I'd like to give you the chance to introduce yourself for our audience.
My name's Amy, and I'm a British Burmese diaspora member. My grandfather was born in Burma, and then he came to England in 1947, so a long time ago. So my family's been in the UK for several generations. I live in the south of England, in the New Forest, which is very, very nice part of the world to live in. We live in a sort of a little small town called Totten, about 30,000 people. So it's sort of, that kind of nice level of community for my 2 children to grow up in. Has a lot of benefits, but it's certainly very different to being in a bigger city like Southampton, where I grew up. And that has some sort of different implications, I think, as a member of diaspora, and as for us now, sort of looking at the 3rd generation living in the UK, and sort of our connections to our family heritage and what that means and what that looks like. So Lucy's she's 9 years old, and like a lot of girls her age, she's very influenced by sort of groups and clubs that her friends are doing. When she was younger, she had some friends who joined Rainbows, which is sort of the earliest on group of Girl Guides, which is sort of the movement that's all across the world. Is pretty much the same name most places, I think. And then when she got older, she was really enjoying it. She started doing brownies, and it's the sort of group where you have all of the different badges that you do, different activities, and you can earn badges on all sorts of different things. And this always really appealed to Lucy, and she really enjoys it. And she's done all sorts of things through it. I think it's quite, certainly seems that these days that they really think about sort of what's going to be enriching, and sort of some of the topics that you never really cover at school. We did one that was all about your rights that was quite interesting a few years ago. They also had a family history badge that she really enjoyed doing, and that was quite a good sort of opening conversation into all sorts of things for us. We sort of back in terms of sort of thinking about culture and heritage and history. That's something that I try to integrate into our life in various different ways. But I think that the sort of the opportunities and the prompts, I guess, that have come from this particular club has been just a really nice in a way that feels just kind of it's very in line with what she's got sort of a whole bunch of peers who are all doing sort of the same or similar things, which has been really nice. And one of the badges, they have sort of different themes, and they get to sort of choose. They often have like a choice of a couple of different badges that they could do. Recently, I can't remember what the category was, but one of the options was this charities badge. And you could kind of tell from a lot of the time, you've got a few different choices and there are different effort levels, and the charities badge is it's a high effort level badge compared to everything else. And I think when I remember talking to the group leader, and they were saying barely anybody does the charities badge really, because it is a lot of effort. You've got sort of all of the badges have like 3 different stages, but sort of each stage with the charities badge was you have to sort of do quite a bit of research on your charity. You have to produce a little fundraising advert. You had to do your own fundraising project, and then sort of write a thank you card and sort of connect with the charity and sort of reflect on the whole process. So it's not by no means low effort, but Lucy was really, really keen to do it. And I think it was very much something that came from her. She was looking through the options and she was really keen to do it. And she sort of almost immediately, when we were, when I was saying, I sort of asked her if there was anything in particular that she said immediately, I'd really like to support a Burmese charity, support Burma, because we'd been talking about, ever since the coup, we talked about it on and off. I mean, obviously in the, especially in the early days, I were, like all of us were, who are connected to Myanmar in any way, I think very affected by it. And it was, come up in, conversations with my side of the family, and we were just, it was something that was just kind of visibly part of family life, and she had questions about it, and we were talking, as time has gone on, we've just kind of continued talking about it. And I think that, I think that it had obviously just slowly seeped in over time, that just came out, it came out, and she had this interest, and it was fantastic that then I was, that I already had this connection. I'd already been a regular donator to, Better Burma, the charity arm of Insight Myanmar, for quite a while, and had built up that trust. And I thought, well, great, here's a perfect opportunity to raise some money for Better Burma, and that and that it's just been a really nice journey, really, from start to finish, with all sorts of journeys along the way. Yes, so Lucy's part of an organisation which is called Girl Guides in the UK. It's sort of known as Girl Scouts in a lot of the world. It's the sort of the group for kids where they're all sort of doing badges. So they've got various different activities that they can do, and then they earn badges for those sort of different activities that they're doing. And it's quite, I've been sort of impressed really about how it's quite different, I think, from how it was a generation or two ago. They seem to have really thought quite a lot about, really different offering from school and making it quite holistic. Lucy's done badges about human rights, and she's done badges about family history, and she's done badges sort of connecting, there are sort of engineering themed ones, and it's all, there's quite a diversity, which I think is really nice thing to offer. Lucy just started doing Girl Guides when she was four or five at school, just because she had friends who had joined, and she wanted to join and do this group as well. But she's really taken to it, and I think she quite she enjoys collecting the badges, I think, is the main thing, and seeing that sort of completion of work and being able to sort of think back over things is something that she really responds well to and that she really enjoys. And now that she's in Brownies at the moment, which is the sort of the middle-age section of Girl Guides, they just start as you move through the organisation, encouraging them. The projects just get a little bit bigger. They're asking them to do sort of slightly more independent things, which I think is really positive. And the charities badge, which Lucy had the option of doing this year, was one of the bigger badges. It was one of the bigger projects, really. And certainly we heard from the leaders that not many people choose to do the charities badge because it has this sort of, because it's a little bit more involved. And so with all of the badges, they generally have sort of 3 different phases. So there are sort of 3 different aspects or 3 different activities that you have to do and provide evidence for in order to get the badge. And yeah, for the charities badge, Lucy had to research a charity. She had to make an advert for that charity, sort of to advertise to people as to why they should donate to this particular charity. And then finally, she had to organise and run a fundraising activity herself. And so Lucy, really quickly from the off, when she was sort of looking through what badges she wanted to do next, at one point she said she really wanted to do the charities badge. And, when we were talking about different charities, she was from the off, she was asking, can I support a Burmese charity? Very much, it wasn't me pushing it on her. It was something that came from her, which I found quite, it was nice that for me that was something that she thought of from the off. I suggested Better Burma because I've supported Better Burma since it was established, so I knew it already. And also I sort of thought that I always like getting the sort of the news reports through of sort of where our money has gone and things. And I figured if we did a bigger donation, that would be a nice thing that we'd be able to sort of see easily and communicate easily and find out sort of what had happened with that donation. And so yeah, she sort of made a really sweet little advert, which I recorded on my phone, and we sent off, and then we were sort of planning for a little while what activity she wanted to do. In the end, she did a sponsored reading challenge, and yeah, she did like a week-long sponsored read, and she was sending this out to sort of lots of different people and sort of trying to raise as much money as possible. And yeah, it was, I think overall it was just a length of project that she had to sustain. She probably spent the better part of a month, probably all in all, chipping away all of the different elements of this badge. And she raised £170, I think around $200 worth of money in that amount of time, which she was really happy. We were all really happy with. It was a really decent sum for her to raise, and it was really nice to be able to then send that off. And she wrote a thank you note along with her donation, which we sent, where she was sort of going into the details of why she had chosen to support Better Burma. And she mentioned about having family, having family in Burma still, which is kind of how we talk about it at home, even though we're not in direct contact with our Burmese family anymore, because it's just too many generations removed. We know that we have cousins basically that are still in Myanmar. and so that's how we sort of talk about it at home. Um, so yeah, that was the project, and then it was only a couple of weeks ago. They're really nice that we got an email through where we had this lovely report of photos and sort of a write up of what our money had been spent on
Mm.
specifically. So it was really nice that that had been sort of set aside for a specific project, and we could sort of follow that. And it was amazing, I think, for Lucy to see the impact of that money and that effort that we had collected together and how many people's lives it had touched in Myanmar. And I think it was a delight and a surprise to all, and even though that the weight of your currency, stretches so much further in Myanmar, but it still really surprised me when we were looking at sort of, how many meals and bottles of water and how many resources that sort of connecting with. I think the report said about 160 different families that were provided with food, I think a couple of meals and drinking water for a week, which was just incredible. And that really floored all of us, really. And it was really, really emotional. It made Lucy feel really emotional and really proud. And she was saying, "Wow, like that was for me. I did that. That was." And sort of to have sort of the messages and to see all the photographs of people who were getting donation packages with her name on it. And yeah, and even getting a couple of messages through from people saying, "Oh, if 9-year-old Lucy, when she's older, you could come to this region, and we'd love to meet you one day. We hope that that's an opportunity that happens." I was reading all of this to Lucy, and it's an emotional thing, and it's a beautiful thing. And I think it feels really positive and really heartwarming to make those connections. Is I think, and that's kind of the best part of um being involved in charity and advocacy work, isn't it? Is when you feel that direct connection rather than it just being kind of a nameless, faceless kind of off into the
Yeah.
ether, and then you never hear or think or see the other side of it. So I think that's the thing that is brilliant about Better Burma, is that you get that connection and you get to see those amazing reports that I, as a regular donator, sort of get through just in the newsletter, which is always it's just brilliant to see the amount of different things that that money is going to support.
Mm. And I do think you raise a very important point about how far currency can stretch, because I'm talking to friends over there, and the prices have gone up
Mm,
horrifically. Like the numbers that I'm being quoted are obscene. I'm being told that a single egg is going for 400 chat. Now, before the
mhm,
coup, a single egg would cost you 100. So that's a quadrupling of
yeah.
prices in the market. But 400 chat, that's still not a lot of money. That's 4,800 chat for a carton of eggs. And even at like a theoretical exchange rate, you're looking at, what is that, like, I don't know, a pound 50 for a carton of eggs. It's not, it's not a horrific price from our perspective. And to the people living there, that's that that's now a staple that has become a luxury food that
Mm,
is very much within our purchasing power to be able to help provide for them. Um, so I do think that's something that's often underappreciated, that you look at a quantity of money and you think, well, what good would it do if I gave it to charity? Surprisingly a large amount.
yeah.
um and yeah, so I think that's relevant, but I just wanted to circle back and double check, what exactly is a sponsored read?
Yeah, so this was we looked at doing a few different sponsored activities as sort of I think the more achievable ones for sort of younger people to do, rather than doing sort of um, if you're doing like a bake sale or something, there can
Mm,
be you know all sorts of kind of health and safety and risk assessments and things that you have to do. Sponsored read was one of the suggestions on the in the girl guiding booklet that we had sort of for this badge. And so Lucy had to, you can do it, I think, sort of a few different ways. Some people try to see how much they can read. Some people might like sponsor an amount of money per page that you read, for instance. So like how many pages you read equates to a certain amount of money. We didn't want Lucy to go sort of too far down any kind of rabbit hole or put too much pressure on herself, because she can be a bit of a perfectionist at
Mhm.
times. So we wanted it to be quite boundary. So we said to her that the challenge for her was to do a minimum of 10 minutes of reading every day of the
Mhm.
challenge. And you know, and for her, you know, she's reading a chapter book independently, which she's not been doing for that long. And it, you know, it did encourage her. She wasn't doing that much independent reading other than what she had to do for her homework, which was so she was doing, you know, like 3 pages a week was what she had to do for her homework for her reading diary. And so she was hitting that minimum every week, but not really going much beyond it. So it was quite a bit extra for her. And obviously, a lot of the time when I think when children are doing sponsored activities, you know, you're going to your band of, you know, family and friends who are gonna they're gonna give some money, you know,
Yeah.
whatever they're doing, whether it's, you know,
Mhm.
a sports event or a reading event. Where you're just looking at that vehicle and giving that
Mhm.
opportunity to sort of go around to friends and family and say, oh, look, you know, like she's got this, creating this goal, you know, wanting to raise this money for this aim, for this purpose. And yeah, so it's just kind of packaging it together in that way. And I think not overcomplicate. I think that was the good thing about the sponsored read, was that it was um, no, it's all quite easy to control. It all felt quite achievable, which I think was good. Some of the other options that we looked at, I feel, would have had just you know, other complicated factors where, you know, you have to do things in public places, or you're just moving through a bit more bureaucracy, I guess.
Mhm. Yeah.
So yeah, the sponsored read was quite good. We avoided that. It was all
Mhm.
easy to do at home.
And I think that's quite it's good that that pathway exists because, you know, on the one hand, there's the obvious sort of argument to be made that maybe we live in a bit of a nanny state and people are a little bit too caught up in paperwork and technicalities. But on the other hand, I mean, you're dealing with a 9-year-old child, so you obviously don't want them to do anything that would actually expose them to legitimate danger, to get a Girl Guide badge. So I think having that opportunity, having that pathway of well, here's an activity that you can do that will be safe, um, but that is also going to enable you to raise money, is going to enable you to do charity work. I think that's a
Mm.
really good opportunity to create. I mean, I remember when I was in Scouts, we did. I assume you have this in the UK. I don't think it's an Australian thing, but Relay for Life. It's a fundraiser for cancer research, but
Mm.
it's just walking around an oval, right? There's just like a racetrack, but people just
Yeah.
walk, and you get sponsored per sort of lap that you do. And so we organized that as a scout troop, and you know we went out and did that again. You know, you're young, but you're under supervision. Like there are a lot of officials there. You're with the scout leaders there,
Mm.
and it's all centrally organized. And so you've got the oversight, you've got the safety, and it's a good opportunity to be able to raise money in a way that's not exposing you to maybe the more stereotypical walk down the street alone with a box of chocolate bars knocking on strange people's front doors.
Yeah, yeah, I suppose that
Yeah,
was, you know, the an approach for a long time, wasn't it, in a lot of
yeah.
places. I think it is good, and I think it's about you know, getting people in, it's about getting people on those steps, right? So
Mhm.
you're wanting to, you know, introduce people to the, and I think as well with this activity, you know, getting involved in a bigger activity where you're one person who's taking part in a big event, is all being organized by, you know, a team that have done lots of this before, is one thing. And then doing something where actually you're independently organizing every step along the way. I mean, like, yes, as Lucy's parents, we were effectively organising all this, but yeah, but we were sort of guiding her through it, and you're wanting to make it not seem like is that like there are insurmountable hoops to go through. Like you want to break it down and go like, yeah, like this is something that you could totally do again, and it's not lots of effort. And so then you're building up that skill level for the future. You're building up the
Mm,
idea that actually if you want to do this again, you totally can. And if you want to do this again and you want to do something that's a bit different or a bit more ambitious, you've got that baseline that you've already
yeah.
done. And I think, it's like with anything, isn't it, where you're trying to be sustainable, you're focusing on the fact that I think Lucy even said in her advert herself about, every, that emphasis on every little bit of money helps, every little project that you do helps. And, the same goes with everything in life. But I think
Mm,
it's a really good reminder for charities because there is that apathy, isn't there, about, you look at the state of the world and it can feel, just really gut wrenching
overwhelming.
and overwhelming. Yeah, exactly. About, but and we have to remind ourselves that, the little things that we do add up. Is all about,
Mm,
being the change that we want to see in the world and focusing on, the good impact and the good bits of loving kindness that we can put out into the world. But yeah, but not getting burnt out in the process is a conversation that I'm seeing more and more, I think, and in climate change activism as well, and all of
mm,
these different and all of these things are obviously interrelated, but we have to do things in a way that is sustainable and scalable and achievable, and we want to make sure that
mm,
when we're introducing, you know seeds to young people, that we're not making it seem overwhelming or a big deal from the off.
yeah.
I think that was something that, and for me as a parent, like it was exciting when Lucy was enthusiastic about it, and then she had some ideas where I was like, oh, that's a lot of work for me. That's a lot
Yeah.
of work for me to, how is that achievable for me? I'd love to support you to do that. Is that achievable for me to do over the next couple of months? I don't, maybe not. If we wanted to do that idea, we'd have to wait longer so that I could,
Yeah.
clear time. And so it's like, and you don't want to lose that momentum either of like, wanting to do a really positive thing. And a lot of the time, the key with children is to, not lose that momentum of that idea, supporting them so they
Mm,
can do it and see that end goal achieved, really brings it home.
absolutely. And I think you've made a really valued point with that idea that just get them doing it at all, because I think there's in life, even across very long periods, there is a concept of, I think, momentum,
Mm,
where if you did something when you were younger, if you already have a connection to it, even if you haven't done it for a while, it gets easier. Like if you rode bikes as a kid, it's going to be easy for you even later in life to get back on the bike and start cycling. Whereas, if you want to take up something completely new, let's say you want to go outside and you want to start doing skateboarding, um, yeah, that's going to be pretty daunting if you've never done it before, if it's not part of your life. And I think charity is much the same. If you have done it, you've created that connection, you've put a bit of momentum early on with it, with an achievable
mm,
task that later on in life is going to make it so that when you look at an opportunity to do charity, it's not going to feel like, oh, this is a totally new, completely, d- d- um, like a deviation from what I'm doing in my life. Rather, you're saying, this is a continuation of something that I've already started doing previously, and you'll be more comfortable doing it and more confident approaching it. So, so I do really think that is a huge component of just having an opportunity for children to do it and
mm,
have it like bite-sized, achievable, as you say, like in the scope of a couple of months, like not something that requires you to jump through a whole bunch of hoops, but something that you can do, plan out, have it done, and then say, I actually have a tangible result and I actually did something good in the world, and I can point to that. No one can take that away from
mm.
me. And then later in life, you're going to think, wow, I kind of want to go back and do that again, because that was pretty good.
Yeah,
So yeah.
I think as well it's just making me think about my own childhood and sort of found I remember my mum, my parents, my mum in particular, always talking about how important it was to to support people around the world, and we did when I was younger, we did the sort of the sponsored child, which was sort of quite a big scheme from the 90s in particular, I think, where you would be you'd have like a pen pal relationship with this one person that you would be like sponsoring their education was sort of a really common thing. And we supported a girl growing up in India, and was sort of paying for her education, and we sort of wrote to her a few times a year. I remember, my mum would read the letters, and we'd get photographs, and we'd send photographs over. And as I got a bit older, I'd sort of, write some letters myself sometimes. And I think that was something that had, again, it was kind of, I know that my mum did donations to other charities, but that was more tangible because it was a one-on-one.
Yeah.
And I think that was something that stuck with me. And then as soon as I was earning myself, I was like, okay, and a small amount of this, I'll like, let's figure out charity, and I'm going to start. And that was something that, because it was something that I'd already seen in a tangible way growing up. Um, Obviously the whole landscape is different now. Everything's online, everything's, social media and GoFundMe, and it's a bit of a different landscape. But I think that the important thing is the mindset and the habit building, just in general. I think
Mm.
is the main thing, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think, it kind of reminds me because I have a friend here locally who's he's a retired athlete. He actually competed in, Commonwealth Games and things like this. But sort of later on in life, he started looking around and saying, well, what is it that he can do that sort of has meaning? And he actually runs a charity over in Myanmar around the Mandalay region, and it is focused on schooling, right? It is an education charity. They
Mm,
run a school, and they have teachers, and obviously they try to make sure that they're paying them like an actual living wage, not the wage that a teacher would normally get over there, and try to give the children the best opportunities they can. But then what he just started discovering as well, it's not just about education, because it's one thing to run the school, but if the children are coming to school with empty stomachs, well, they can't focus. If the children have,
mm,
untreated medical issues, obviously they can't study.
yeah.
And so obviously it then has to expand. It has to expand. It's like, okay, we have to make sure we're paying these people. We also have to make sure that we're feeding people. We also have to make sure we're taking care of everyone. So now in the post-coup period, his charity continues to operate. It continues to run. He's sending money back in whatever mechanism he can. He does fundraisers, every year, twice a year. Um, Mostly, his network and people that he's built connections with across his life who come along and, you know, raise a few $1,000s here and there and send that. But it's it's one of those things where he also understands that it's about tangible outcome. And he gave a
Mm,
speech at the last fundraising event where he's trying to explain the difference between our zone of interest and our zone of impact. And it's like, of course, we're interested in all of Myanmar. We are interested in all of
yeah.
the civilians who are suffering. We can't help all of them, but we do have a zone of impact where
Yeah.
these are the people that we do have infrastructure set up to put money in their pockets, to put food on their table, and we can help those people. And these are those people, like very specific individual human beings that we have a choice to either help right now or not help right now. And I think putting it in those terms makes it much more tangible, and it creates that human
Mm,
connection, and it really drives that motivation to take action and not just sort of say, well, like, yeah, it sucks, but it's not
yeah.
really my problem. So yeah, I do appreciate the perspective that you would get from, as you were saying, the adopt a child um, program, which we don't really see much of these days.
No,
Mm.
no, I think it's sort of obviously postal communication
Yeah.
isn't so much of a thing. I think that was kind of the charm of it, really, was
Mm.
the physical letters that you would get, that, was, yeah, certainly it had an impact on me. And yeah, I think it is. It's planting these seeds, and yeah, but tangible things. I think that makes an impact, and I think getting the seeing photographs and having those opportunities for
Mm.
connection. I think that's quite the good thing about a project where you're sending a sum of money, like in this case, where you could see the impact of that lump sum was really impactful for Lucy. It's something that
Mm.
we're going to print off and keep, and that she can look back on and remember, and yeah, set these in place for future things.
Absolutely. And so, looking at, as you say, like the impact of photographs, let's pivot then from photographs of what's happening right now to photographs from the archive and looking back at history. So your family history is fascinating. It's
Mm,
like, as we were talking previously, was sort of, you obviously know the history, but to me it's being sort of revealed layer by layer by layer. um so I want to jump all the way back then, because if I remember correctly, it was your great grandmother who migrated in 1947 to the
yes.
United Kingdom. um so that's an interesting time to be migrating. What was the, just right off the bat, what was the impetus for her to migrate in 1947, especially as a woman? Like, for a lot of men, I understand it was normalized to migrate to the United Kingdom to find work opportunities,
Mm.
and that was considered, socially acceptable as well. Okay, a man can go overseas and he can work and he can send money home, but for a woman to go overseas, I believe by herself, I think that's a, or unaccompanied by a husband or a father, I think that would probably have been a much harder sell in society at that time. So can you tell us what led to that?
Yeah, so we've got, my great grandmother. She was in her late 20s, early 30s at the time, and she already had my great aunt. So in 1947, she would have been about 8 or 9 years old,
Mm.
and my granddad, who was 6 when they left Burma, as it was then. And so we've got this family unit. My Really, we've got the context of the Second World War right there, obviously. And my family were Eurasian, so they were part of the Anglo-Burmese, Anglo-Indian community. Sort of the group of people who were converted Christians. They'd taken European names. They fulfilled this economic role of working very closely with the British empire bureaucracy. Specifically, members of my family were train drivers specifically, and they were all sort of educated in the like convent schools, and they were Catholics. So we've got this context where they're in this particular pocket of Burmese society at the time, and my great grandfather, was his family were Indian originally. They'd been in Burma for, I think, 2 generations at the point that my great grandparents met. But the time that they met and were getting married, you've got the sort of the race riots against Indians were happening in the 1930s, around the time when they were getting married. So I think that things were always, there was always kind of a backdrop of different things about the sort of the specific place in society that the that my family and the sort of Eurasian community in general were holding down, this sort of funny place of being between a lot of things, being this connecting point between a lot of things. And it had the sort of, at the time, very obvious economic pulls and economic reasons to do so. And by this point, for family, it was just people were born into it. Obviously, you're quite a long time since the British conquest of Burma, and that machine of empire, and incentivizing the people to join the Eurasian community to intermarry between these different groups for this specific purpose had been going on for a period of time. But when the Second World War broke out, it was really difficult for this group of Anglo-Burmese, Anglo-Indians, all of the other sort of mixed group of people who form the Eurasian community. There were already tensions at times for this group and the place that they held. This sort of pinch point between all of these different groups, and that was always complicated. As evidenced by sort of various race riots and things that happened that blew back on the community at times. At the outset of the war, the British pulled out because they couldn't hold Burma to the Japanese. They pulled out. They retreated to India, and the Japanese were coming. And anybody who had a connection to the British were going to be put in concentration camps. And people knew about this. And the British government's advice to the Eurasian community in particular was, get out of the country, get to India. And it was called the Great Trek. So, there was this migration of all of these people from these different groups trying to get to India. With my family specifically, I think that, being train drivers, they were based down in the south in Moulmein and Yangon, and trying to sort of get all the way up the country on the train lines. It's obviously quite a long journey, and then the last bit of the trek was through jungle. And I believe that they started this journey together, but then there was a bomb got dropped on one of the train lines, and my great grandfather was injured. And then, as they were crossing through some of the jungle to get to another piece of train line to carry on their journey, he contracted malaria and he died. At the time of that period, that was in 1941. My great aunt was 3 years old, and my granddad was only 7 months old. So we have my great grandmother now. She's in her mid-20s. She's got 2 really small children to try and look after, and she was by herself. And she sort of went into hiding for a couple of years, and then eventually she was caught by, discovered by the Japanese, and sort of taken with that connection of the sort of the anglicized names and the anglicized culture, being Catholic, being taken into the concentration camps for that reason. So that was, all 3 of them, which was, I think when I've read the history and I've looked at the statistics, and the only statistics that I found really was that I think one in 3 people who did the Great Trek died on the way, but that was a better survival rate than people who ended up in the camps. I've not found a specific statistic in my research. That was the only sort of reference that I found. I couldn't find a source for what that data was, but that was a statistic that I found in one of the books that I was reading when I was researching this piece of history. And so I think on that. And when I found that when I was doing this research, my children were about that age, and I was about the age that my great grandmother was at the time. And I just think, wow, like I can see why she made the decision that she made not to, because how can you with a 3-year-old and a baby that you're carrying? Like, there's no way that you're going to be able to make that journey through the jungle, and that you're going to make it out with all of you in one piece. So I can understand why she went against the advice and tried to stay and banked on sort of hiding her identity for as long as she could. And I think that it was luck and remarkable, and due to her wit and fortitude, that all 3 of them managed to survive. They were in the concentration camp for over a year before the end of the war. Yeah.
That's, I
And
mean, that for
yeah,
children in a
yeah,
concentration camp, that's rough.
Yeah, so you're looking at my really formative time for my granddad and his older sister. It forms the banks of their earliest memories from that period of time. Um, and it's one of those things that, in terms of our family history, you know the base details. You know that was something that happened. You know that they ended up in the camps. You know what age they were. But we don't have much in the way of like specific anecdotes. It was too difficult for my great grandmother to talk about it afterwards. She avoided talking about it. And I think certainly for my granddad, they were really confusing memories for
Mm,
him. When he was really towards the end of his life, he would talk about sort of snippets of images and things that he could remember of sort of, bodies piled up and these sorts of images that came to him. But I think that it was just sort of confusing. And they didn't have like an avenue without the sort of the knowledge that we have now of sort of, mental health and how to deal with trauma. There was nobody giving any advice of actually it would be beneficial to talk about it. It would be beneficial to form a narrative. It would really the instinct that they had was, or just not talk about it, just try and forget about it.
mm,
Um, and I think that, sort of quite quickly at the end of that experience, and it is a human impulse, isn't it? Right? If we've survived, we've made it through this really difficult chapter, and that impulse to sort of try and get back into normal life and
mm,
different rhythms is there. And they had a house in Yangon, and as was the case, you have, towards the end of the war, you have lots of soldiers who are from all different places who are waiting quite a long time in some cases for a ship back home. And they had because I think if you had a spare room going, you were encouraged to take in a soldier. And obviously, again, with um, the Eurasian community sort of connections to the British, and possibly, I imagine that there would have been a little bit of rent money, which would have been very helpful sort of incentive to take in soldiers. And one of the soldiers that they took in, um, they sort of formed a relationship. And um, uh, when he went back to Britain, they sort of said about wanting to sort of come back, and he came back to Burma, and they got engaged and got married. And their intention at that point was that he wanted to live in Burma. They wanted to stay in Burma together. But then, of course, you have Burmese independence, you have Aung San's assassination, and you have the rise of, the first parts of, Burmese nationalization and trying to sort of get rid of all foreigners. And where by this point my great grandmother had married a British man, this meant that once again the family was under attack for who they were and in danger because of this. And so they made the decision to come to the UK. And I think that my step great grandfather came back first and sort of set things up. And my great grandmother originally, it was always kind of um, a temporary idea. It was, oh, we'll come to England for a year or two before returning to Burma. And at one stage, my granddad and his sister were actually going to be left behind with the grandparents in Burma. That was the original plan, but the my step grandfather was insistent. He thought that it was really important that they should all stick together as a core family unit, and that they should all come over. So they did. So the three of them came over in 1947 by ship. Again, sort of, core memories for my granddad. I know. It's a long journey, and they went from obviously going through really different environments because it was winter when they arrived in the UK and it was snowing. And that was one of the things that my granddad always talked about, was that he'd never really seen snow before. So yeah, and sort of adjusting to the cold temperatures, and yeah, and then they went to my great grandmother's new husband's family village, and they were lived in a farmhouse in a small village in East Anglia. So yeah, it's a really different kind of migration story to, like you said, when you're looking at economic migrants. It's a very different story. I think that this intermarriage story for people from Southeast Asia, I think it is actually it's not uncommon. I think, especially in this time period, I think that was how a reasonable number of people migrated. But you end up in, rather than the economic migrations, which are going to specific places and they form communities in that place, it's quite, what this sort of intermarriage migration is, quite spread out across the country. And so I think that these stories aren't recorded or archived in the same way as that kind of bigger economic migration story, which sort of had a more visible impact and a more visible kind of waves when it happened.
Mm.
So yeah, that was how it came. And then unfortunately, the situation didn't resolve anything well, not at all really, in terms of making them feel like it was ever really a good time to go back, with the identities that they held.
I mean, I can imagine that, but I think what I find fascinating is as you're saying, like, this is the type of relationship, this is the type of story that at the time would have made a lot of sense, been very common. And what's interesting is when we have these types of discussions, and I've had other guests come on and talking about history, talking about the period of time after independence, the period of time after the coup of Ne Win, and contrasting it with what I saw in Myanmar. Like, I was in Myanmar during the Rohingya genocide. So
Mm,
I'm not saying that it was a beacon of tolerance and acceptance, but what I saw, at least in Yangon, was you had a relatively clearly defined Myanmar community, not entirely Burmese, but a relatively clearly defined sort of you know community of Burmese and the other native ethnic groups. You had relatively clearly defined Indian community, again, a lot of subgroups there, relatively clearly
mm,
defined Chinese community, and everyone sort of more or less got along. And then when you look back, there were anti-Chinese purges,
yeah.
and riots and violence. There were anti-Indian riots and purges, and you're saying, of course, now this Eurasian community existed as not just an ethnic group, but existed seemingly as a socio-political tranche, and that they also were subjected to discrimination and violence because of their connection to the British.
Mm,
And you've got these people who don't sit neatly into a box, and societies in flux do not tolerate people who do not sit in a pigeonhole um, neatly. There's it sort of reminds me, there's a tongue-in-cheek sort of dark line from a Family Guy episode where they have this slave period in the southern US,
mm,
and a white woman marries a black man, and they have children, and so one of the children just says in this comedically optimistic tone, the great thing about being half white and half black is that when I grow up, I'm going to be accepted by everyone. And of course we know that that's not how things work. That has
mm,
never in the history of humans been how things work. And it's really, I don't know, it's unsettling, but it's also fascinating to look at a society where I've gone to people and I've tried to tell them like, hey, like you are aware that there were anti-Chinese purges, right? Like you're aware of this element of history, and they will deny it. They'll say, no, no, that's propaganda. That must be, weird British colonial lies to convince you that Myanmar independence was a bad idea or something, because we would never do such a thing. And I'm like, no, 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 no. We have evidence of this, and they just won't believe it. And it's that same society. It's those people 1 or 2 generations back, and things were so different, and the dynamics were so different, and even that British officer, just that very concept of saying, yeah, I want to move to Burma, and I want
Mm.
to live there,
It was a
which,
really common thing. It was, it was a
yeah.
really, it was the jewel of the empire. It was
Mm,
seen as this, amazing locale with, what, and you read in the sort of the colonial reports, people were very enthusiastic, even people who had been posted in India and then moved to Burma from there. You could see this it was obviously highly romanticized, highly
mm,
exotified image. But because there are, and it's always this frustration that I think any British Burmese person has, where you're kind of aware that Burma was the jewel of the British Raj, and there's all of this rhetoric around it, and this whole idea that like people are British people in British popular culture. You've got sort of, if you're thinking of like exotic place names where like a character in a story has been born, you quite often see in sort of in fiction, in literature, all that they were born in Rangoon. It's this really
hmm,
exotic place name. Is up there with Zanzibar. It's up there with these other place names that just hold this position in sort of British literature psyche, this kind of romanticized psyche. And so plenty of people will be like, oh, Rangoon, like they'll know it as this like exotic place name, but they
hmm,
have no knowledge at all. Like if you say, if you say that you're Burmese, and normally it's because somebody's asking you, they won't have heard of so many people in Britain, and obviously like, and I've had this conversation where it's like, yeah, I even though I'm interested in these things, because Britain colonized so many places. It's not like
hmm,
I could sit and list every single country, or have a detailed knowledge about every single place. But still, it's that whole thing about sort of the generations of memory and how things get distorted over time. I mean, that's kind of where um, my story, my identity, and my sort of exploration of my Burmese history sort of begins with, because from sort of growing up, and I'm mixed race, because my family have been here for generations, and sort of intermarrying with other immigrants, but European immigrants that also migrated to England. But still, in terms of like how I look, people still, I don't look white British, and so people do ask. I've been asked ever since I was a child, a school child, walking down the streets. Had strangers stop me on the street and ask me, where I was from, and they've never seen anybody who looks quite like me. And that's kind of mixed race, imposter syndrome, and anxiety, and sort of going home from school and looking in the mirror and wondering what it is about your facial features, or is it just the tone of my skin? Is it the shape of my nose? Is it the shape of my eyes? What is it that makes people come and have these weird conversations with me? And there's this kind of narrative around being mixed, and the types of conversations that people want to have with you, where they want to understand what box to put you in, and they want to know, okay, right, if you're mixed race, then what, like, tell me about your brown ancestor, or and they would be really frustrated. People would get really frustrated with me when, what are your parents and where are your parents from, and be like, well, they're from here. They were,
yeah,
we've always lived in, even we've not even moved city. We've been in
mm,
specifically in Southampton, the south of England, for a long time. And we're like, well, what about your grandparents? Like, also been here for a really long time. And say, well, and I'm like, okay, like, I'm part Asian, and I've got this Burmese branch to my family, Burmese and Indian, ethnicity. And they say, oh, like, well, you're great grand. And I remember being asked, like, well, people want to find that exotic name. So, and it would confuse me, because this would be the conversation, be like, well, what's your name's Amy, obviously, really British name. What's your mum's name? Melanie. What's your granddad's name? Edmund. Yeah, that's my
Yeah.
granddad's first name. What about your great grandmother, your Burmese great grandmother? Her name was Hilda. And, you could see, like, it's just not computing in people's minds. And I didn't know, to me, especially when I was younger, I was like, well, those are just their names. Like, you're asking me for their names, those are their names. And it creates this kind of, it feels odd, because you can see that your reality is not computing with
Mm.
the story that they're expecting. And I think that as I got older, I started getting more curious. And I think that there was a part of me that wanted to find that, indigenous ancestor. I want, part of me that was like, okay, well, what, sort of reading these stories of, like, okay, so do we have this sort of, did the Christianity and did the anglicized names come from, a further back mixed relationship, sort of mixing between sort of, an earlier British officer, and someone who's indigenous, and then finding that my great grandmother had created this family tree, is on a typewriter, and you have to sort of piece it together like a puzzle. It's on sort of like 6 different sheets of
Mm.
typewriter paper, with sort of all of these different sort of circled lines that take you sort of down, like, this branch of the family. She's sort of running out of space in different places. And this was to help her, I think, to keep track of her cousins and the different marriages, as she sort of continued to, particularly sort of writing to cousins and family and friends out in Burma still, for throughout her whole life. But she sort of recorded, and she went back several generations. And I found it really, because I was kind of like looking at this, going like, oh wow, this goes back several more generations than I ever thought I'd be able to get my eyes on. And I'm like, oh, okay, like, so where are the Burmese names going to start coming in? And it doesn't really, because it's
Yeah.
this funny thing where I'm looking for this, um, this story that other people expect I'm going to have, and that by this point I'm expecting that I'm going to have, like, I'm going to find this, you know, this story of, intermarriage, or possibly, somebody being um forced into these situations, which, you hear happens a lot as well. People, not necessarily a consensual marriage, but, sort of, that was how members of the Eurasian community formed as well. People sort of being left pregnant and sort of
Mm.
giving their children to be, educated in the Christian schools, and sort of forming the community that way. But yeah, but equally, lots of people also converted and, adopted more European cultural practices as a way of social mobility. And the sort of the further back I look in this family history, and looking at the names, and like, I can see on the family tree there are, um, some people who have two, they have two names. They have a Burmese name, and they obviously have a name that they took after marriage, after sort of, becoming a member of the community. And then sort of further down, sort of in more modern times, sometimes my great grandmother had, instead of putting down a name, she put actually married Burmese. So she didn't actually record, the Burmese spouse's name, which I always found
Wow.
quite interesting. It was like, oh, they did get married, but they married. I was kind of fascinating. But yeah, for me, sort of, looking back and going, well, actually, I've always been told that, for me to exist as a mixed race, um, Asian person in the UK, who, with several generations of, mixed family members, that this is some kind of abnormality. But actually, I look at, that family history of being part of a mixed community goes back a really long way. It stretches back right to the very I not the earliest parts of that family tree have dates on, but I think based on how many generations up it goes, it's going to the start of British colonialism in Lower Burma. So it's going
Mm.
right back to then, to sort of, the 1870s, 1880s.
I mean, it
And
would have to. I mean, if she, if your great grandmother's existing in like the 1940s, sits down and writes this presumably sometime in the 1950s or 60s, and so if we're
mm,
going back a couple of generations from there, I think that yeah, it's inescapable. You are probably looking
yeah,
at the very least the Third Anglo-Burmese War.
because she had recorded. I think it records um, three generations above her. You've got her parents, her grandparents, and her great grandparents are
And she
on
would have
that.
been born in the 20s.
Yeah, she was born in the 20s. Yeah.
Yeah, and so three generations. I mean, that's about 60 years. So
Mm,
yep.
yeah.
That's pretty intense. Very few people can say that they have that much of an insight into their family history.
I know. I
Um,
mean, when my granddad passed away, and I sort of took on the job of sort of, I took all of his photographs, and he'd collected a load of things from my great grandmother's house when she had passed away. And I took it on as a job that I could do to be helpful, and it just blew me away to find that, really, because it was something that, yeah, I by that point, I think I'd already been researching. I'd already seen that, the sort of the destruction of, a lot of birth certificates from the British Raj have just gone, and thinking, okay, well, like, I'm only going to know what I know. I'm only going to know what's in living memory, and then to find this document that my great grandmother had put together was really quite incredible. Although it raised a whole bunch of different unanticipated questions.
mm,
And of course, sort of, certainly quite a bit of grappling of identity for me, because it wasn't what I was expecting to find. But that expectation really just came from how other people responded to me, how other people responded to just my lived existence. And that
mm.
sort of, yeah, and that was what
Because
formed those experiences and
as
expectations.
you're talking about your lived experience, that was the weird thing to me is that you're saying, well, these people are getting confused because your lived experience doesn't conform to their expectations, which in and of itself I think would be fine. But the way you tell it, it feels to me very much like the problem was not so much that your lived experience was confusing them. The problem seems to be more that it sounds like they wanted you to justify your existence and your experience
Yeah.
and present it in terms that were convenient to them and fit into a specific narrative, which I think is where it gets into dangerous territory. It's not about, oh, you're different than I am. This is an opportunity for me to learn. It's more, you're different than I am, and this makes me angry, and I demand that you justify yourself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I mean, we're talking about microaggressions and not so microaggressions in
Mm,
terms of growing up as diaspora in the UK. And I grew up in Southampton. It's a pretty big city. It's a port city. There are reasonable, diverse communities that have always lived in Southampton, going back quite a long time, because it's a port. So it's always had that history. Um, but yeah, at the time that I was growing up in the 90s and the 2000s, it was still very normalized behavior and I
mm,
think, again, sort of being there by this point in the sort of in the 90s, and I guess even going back further, you have the set narratives around certain types of certain groups, certainly around sort of South Asians, and you have, like, particular narratives around, people who look like this are going to be from this place and for this reason, and we discriminate against them in these ways and for these reasons. And if you look even somewhat like those people, you'll be lumped in with that group. And, like, certainly
yeah.
that was my mum's experience, was that she was always lumped in as, like, a brown skinned Asian looking person, as, oh, you must be Pakistani,
Mm.
which, and that was something that she warned me about before I went to school. But by that point, that wasn't the dominant narrative. So actually, I had, sort of, when people were lumping me in with groups, it was more with East Asian discrimination terms that
Yeah.
were being used against me. And, so these things sort of shift and change. But I think, what is similar for both of our experiences, for my mum and for me, is that, we're being lumped in with a group that isn't, it's just kind of a confusing experience, because it's like there's no way to win, there's no way to
Mm.
counter it. It's happening for, there's no logic to it.
Yeah.
It's yeah, and when you're trying to explain to people, when people are digging into, oh, where are you from then, or where are your ancestors from, or any of
Yeah.
the, and it's always there's always a tone, there's always,
Mhm.
even before you start the conversation, it's kind of pointless in a way. The kind of person who's asking you
It's
is,
where are you really from?
anything you say is going to be taken
Yeah.
in the it's not going to lead to connection. It's very rarely going to lead to connection. um but yeah, and then this just kind of confusion, lack of knowledge about Burma, about Myanmar. Obviously we have the complication in modern times that some people are more likely to have heard of Burma, some people are more likely to have heard of Myanmar. A lot of people are not aware of the connection between those two places. Well,
Yeah.
not two places, but the two names, and just a lack of knowledge really about Southeast Asian history at all in the UK, because there's much more of an emphasis on South Asia in the curriculum, because that is seen as the kind of the biggest Asian community, in which it is, I think, based on demographic data. But we have really significant populations of Southeast Asians, but it's really invisible and really minimized. And that's sort of been
Mm.
a campaign in recent years, since COVID, really, when we saw the sort of the great uptick in hate crimes against anybody who had East or Southeast Asian appearance. It sort of brought people together a bit. So
Yeah.
yeah, we carry on, we advocate, but it's important. I think that's part of the reason why, um, like dealing with racism from other people
Mm.
when you're looking different, and from my perspective, this whole narrative about, oh, that you get from some immigrants of like, well, if you just integrate more, then you won't be subjected to this kind of behavior. And I can very emphatically say from my family's experiences that it doesn't matter if you can have a very English name, you can be tick any British box in terms of culture that you think, be it doesn't matter. It's there are some people are just going to be racist to you anyway. And I think that having the count my experience is that having the connection,
Mm.
having the real knowledge about your cultures and your ancestors and your heritage, and untangling that internalized racism is really important to help you to actually forge that sense of self and identity, in a healthy and holistic way. And it's been incredibly healing to me when my granddad passed away, and I wanted to understand what my relationship was to my ethnicity and being British Burmese outside of that tangible relationship that I had with him. And what does it mean for my children who are white passing, I would say. Um, what does it mean for them? What does it mean down the generations, and how are we going to carry this on? But I think that it's important, because I know that there are people out there who probably, similar to me, but we just happen to be a family where every generation that's been born has still, up to me, has still looked not white British. But there'll be other families with stories just like mine, but just they started looking white British a bit sooner, and then that changes things a bit, but you still have that internalized racism to deal with. You still have the erasure of stories, the erasure of stories that I think are really important because it forms part of British history, it forms part of Burmese history, it forms part of, yeah, we're denying these stories when we are chopping off these parts of ourselves to try and fit in, and it doesn't even work. It doesn't even work in terms of
It
healing
absolutely
and
doesn't. And I think it's worse than that. Just, looking at the current context, you look at the United Kingdom now and the people who've gone out onto the streets to protest, and you've got this person who's murdered a bunch of children, who, as it turns out, is not a migrant, who's, as far as I know, was born in the United Kingdom and was Christian, and yet you've got a lot of people who immediately just associated that with Muslims and immediately associated that
mm,
with migrant communities. And so you've got, it was really weird. I was watching interviews with people in the street. And so you've got a lot of people who are, predominantly Pakistani or Bangladeshi or what have you. And they're saying, well, because they're coming to us and they're coming to our homes and our businesses and our mosques, we feel that we have to come out onto the street. We feel that we have to do a demonstration of force because we're sick and tired of being told that when the EDL comes out, the English Defense League comes out and says a whole bunch of racist stuff, they get hand waved away as like, well, they're lunatics and they're extremists and nobody really takes them seriously. But if you have a Pakistani or a Bangladeshi or a Middle Easterner coming out saying similarly extremist rhetoric, that gets plastered all over the news, that gets ridden as far as they can take it to try to convince people that they're coming, good God, they're coming. And it's frustrating and it's terrifying. And I think what you're saying about racism, and what you're saying about the types of people who ask these questions of like, oh, where are you from and what are your grandparents' names and all that sort of stuff, it's one thing to say, well, it doesn't really matter because you know they're not engaging in good faith. But I think it just keeps coming up that if we're not having these conversations, if it's not normalized across society to explain that, like, yes, there are people in this country who do not look like you and maybe do some things that are alien to you, and that's fine. And there are reasons for that. You don't need to know what those reasons are. You just need to calm down and let people be who they are. If we don't normalize that, I think it's just always one step away that the people are going to snap and they're going to direct their anger towards the people that they fundamentally don't like, whether
mm.
or not those people have done anything wrong, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly like the last month has been a really interesting backdrop, like you say, to us having this conversation, and it hits such a nerve. I think whenever things like this happen, there's always such a divide where I think even the most well-meaning um, white British person, anybody who has grown up being part of the majority group, just don't understand how it hits you when you're worried about how these things can be directed against you when you're just walking out and about,
Mm,
especially with how sort of, randomized and sort of, really widespread across the country these recent riots have been.
mm,
And I think, it's important to look at, this is what I've been reminding myself, is that, things have changed. The overt violence that was, a really normal part of every migrant, every person who didn't look and act white British all of the time. That was widespread, normalized, daily experience in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and even going down further.
yeah.
And that is no longer the case. Things have changed, things have improved. Yes, when I was growing up, I did experience, overt racism, but I experienced it in pockets. I didn't experience it every day. And that's a difference, compared
Mm,
to, my older family members. And I think that things are really improving a lot in a lot of the inner city schools where you have sort of more awareness around, trying to be more multicultural, or some schools are getting it right, and and things are changing in some work organizations, some of these bigger institutions. We've the Equality Act, the 2010 Equality Act really changed, really moved the dial a lot in the UK in terms of people finally feeling like they really had to, or having, or people from marginalized identities feeling like, okay, like now we can say that you have to do this, and it has changed things. But there's still a lot more to be done, and I think it frustrates for me living in a more rural area, as a lot of people do. There is still more that needs to be done, but it's not the same as it was. I think that the particular political background in the UK is bringing out this minority of people that you know have can have a whole long conversation about
Yeah.
it all, and I'm sure it will be something that will be talked about for a really long time as sort of a bit of a turning point for things. But yeah,
Mm.
it's um but yeah, I mean, I think for me, I think part of the project of it's this whole thing, isn't it, where it's like solidarity, where it's like all of these intersectional social justice issues all around the world, and how connected they all are. And like no one's free until everyone's free, and all of this kind of it's on every level, and we need to be thinking about all of these things. And I think that actually the deep healing work of looking at your heritage and your history and connecting to that. And I think that that's important also for people who are white European, or think that they are fully white British, and it's actually connecting to those stories, is, I think, it's important and healing for us to know more of our history, and to know more of British colonial history is really important. And I heard somebody commenting on the riots, where they're talking about, people talk about Britain being a multicultural society, and pushing back on that and saying, I don't think we do. I think we have a multi-ethnic
Mm.
society, but it's not multicultural because you're expected to conform to the dominant culture.
Yes.
So and I think that that's the case in a lot of um, colonial, a lot of the sort of colonial countries, I suppose, America and Australia as well. Um,
And
yeah.
I think you touch on some very important points, because I teach a semester on politics, history, and identity at the Spring University. And one of the key things that I try to teach students is, studying history is fascinating. It's a brilliant thing to do.
Mm.
But one of the important things is that you don't know, yeah, you don't know much about your own history. Like, you think you do, but you don't. And the more you look at the history of your country, and the more you look at the history of like where your identity comes from, the more you start realizing, like, oh, I was raised on a mythology that is
Mhm.
not actually real, and I
Yes.
need to radically re-examine who I think I am and how I think I fit into the world. Um, so that's, and that's the thing. But and so I just want to turn then to the next generation then, because I think what you said is completely accurate. That, yeah, people were very heavily pressured to conform, very heavily pressured to anglicize, and to not pass on their heritage and to not cling to their heritage. So what I want to ask is, how did that happen with your mother, who I believe then would have been born in the United Kingdom, and then you?
Mhm.
How are you able to manage that transmission of Burmese identity, and that, and of Myanmar identity, and that, how are you able to hold on to that connection?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, for us, it's been, not a straight line by any means. I think that, I think that for my mum, those tangible connections, my great grandmother, bless her. I mean, she didn't pass away until I was 12, so she was around for a long time. So, she was quite a present part of my mum's life. She didn't pass away until, my mum was in her like mid-30s. So, that kind of length of connection, makes a big difference. The sort of food culture makes a big difference. But yeah, I mean, I think that the sort of the erasure of stories, the fact that it's been difficult for our older family members to um, reflect on their Burmese stories because it's wrapped up in trauma, um, has complicated things. And I think that the fact that it was difficult, even when I was growing up, it was very difficult to find information. If you just wanted to find really basic information about the country, because it was just a bit more of a niche topic in the UK. So, like I remember us going down to Southampton Library and looking for books on Burma, and I think we managed to find like one like coffee table book that had like a few pictures in. It was very difficult to find information. It's so much easier now with the internet, and I think that in the last sort of 5 years that um, I've really used the internet as a tool to connect, to find those books that I never would have been able to find by myself in a library or in a bookshop or anywhere else, because now I can search the whole catalogue. Now I can find, the books that are actually about Burmese topics, even though they don't have Burma or Myanmar in the name. It's just easier to find these things and find this information. And we're able to connect more directly through social media in particular to um, other people who, you follow the hashtags, you can find other Burmese diaspora, you can find and connect with people who, are on social media who are in Myanmar themselves. And that's been an amazing connection for me to be able to build. And I feel like I've grown in so much knowledge, much deeper connections in the past few years. And the fact that, I've been able to get Christmas presents for my family that have been, made by Burmese craftspeople that, and supporting projects and doing that. And it's just very, very meaningful. And I think that um, my mum is always looking for those connections. I think that, and so am I. I think it's meaningful, it's healing, and yeah, and I think that it's about, down the generations. You have to let things shift and change and evolve, and yeah, and I think about it in terms of how I want to connect with my heritage and my culture, and it's kind of in a living, breathing way as well, because I'm integrating now, new recipes from Burmese cookbooks and things that weren't passed down through my family, but I'm finding them and enjoying them, and they'll be part of my kids' childhood. Um, and yeah, and maybe my kids will, really enjoy that food and continue cooking it for, many decades to come, or maybe they won't, and sort of being free with that idea. But I think that, yeah, it's important to create that cohesive narrative for yourself. And I think for children, at least giving them access to resources that they can explore, and hearing all of those family stories and trying not to erase, and giving as full a picture as you can. And if you've got some mythology, we have some mythology in our family for sure. I always try to say, well, we've got this story. I think it's just a story though. It might be true, it might not be. Giving all of that. The stories count too. The mythology counts too. It's all part of the wholeness.
All right, so I want to turn now to Lucy herself. Obviously, we agreed before doing the interview that we wouldn't bring Lucy on for reasons of child safety, but we'd very much be interested to hear your interpretation of what Lucy's told you regarding her identity and regarding her experiences. And the first thing that I really sort of want to ask about is, to what extent is Lucy really connected to that Burmese heritage, that Burmese identity? Because I know that you've done these deep dives, you've looked at your grandmother and your great grandmother, and you've looked at that heritage. But Lucy's still quite young. I don't imagine that she'd be able to read those same documents that you're reading and really appreciate the research that you're doing. So do you feel, or does Lucy feel that there has been that connection to that Burmese heritage throughout her life to this point?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, I'll sort of start by just sort of reiterating that Lucy's, she's 9, she's almost 10 years old. So we've had, almost a whole decade of parenting and experiences. And I think that she, especially recently, I think that she is getting to that age where, she's totally able to, have those, because she's very smart and she's very interested in the world. She's very interested in those conversations and being able to sort of to dive into that source material and just the same kinds of things that I look at, and she approaches it in a different way.
Mm.
But I can sort of, I think, from if I sort of think back over the whole journey from when she was little. I'm just trying to think now. I think that Lucy was about 4 years old when my granddad died. So that was obviously her, uh, that was for me, that was, it had a huge impact on me because that was, my direct contact because, granddad was born in Burma, and that was something that we used to talk about, and was kind of that, just that living connection, really. And yes, we have extended family members, but you're just not, they live further away. You're just not, they're just, it's not a close family
Mm.
relationship in the same way. They're just not like naturally present in your life. So I think that probably up until that point when Lucy was 4, I hadn't thought about it too much, other than thinking about it from like a food perspective, and sort of like making sure that I was kind of introducing like a wide variety of sort of food flavors, and that sort of food culture was there from the beginning, because I love cooking and eating Burmese food so much, and I always have. So I sort of very much always integrated that, and I think that that's probably one of the easiest ways to get it in there
Mm.
from very young with children. I think there was a great picture book as well that I got. Um, that I might have had that from when Lucy was like a toddler. It's called "I See the Sun in Myanmar." It's like a whole series of picture books. Like, we also have "I See the Sun in India," and it's kind of these picture books they're a combination of like artistic collage and sort of cartoons, but interspersed with real photographs of the place. And it's basically just following a child as they go through a regular day, and it's just sort of showing you sort of where they live. And they're bilingual books as well, so you have you know the the English words, and then you also have the Burmese script, or whichever other language they from the culture that they're exploring. And so that was a really great find. That was one of the earliest picture books that I found, that I felt was kind of quite accessible, I think, for sort of quite early ages, because it's just following a little girl as she goes throughout her day, and she sees her grandma, her ama, and sort of various family members. It talks about her dad and her brother going off fishing down the Iwadi River. And they see a neighbor and they have lapet. And so it's just kind of, and you get this sort of really nice combination of sort of, you've got with the photographs as well as the sort of the artwork. So it's kind of bringing that connection. It was a really lovely book, and I'd really recommend it to anybody who has young children, or even just wants it for themselves. It's a really lovely series. The other thing that I really liked about it was that it's kind of, the whole thing is kind of bookmarked and integrated with the meta the sort of Buddhist loving kindness, the may you be safe, may you be happy and peaceful mantra is sort of, that's at the beginning of the book, and it sort of pops up in the middle, and then it's sort of ended. She starts her day with it, she ends her day with it in bed when she's sort of saying the words to herself, and she's sending out loving kindness to herself and to her family members, and then that became something that sort of from reading that story in that book with Lucy when she was little, I sort of thought, oh, this would actually be a really lovely thing to put into our daily routine. And so then that became doing that, doing sort of a variation on the meta kind of rhyme in English became part of our bedtime routine. And we must have started that probably whenever I got that book. So when she was about 2 or 3, that was when I sort of prompted the idea, and we still do it now. And I think that was kind of, it was also really good into talking about Buddhism and talking about those connections. And I think that was kind of quite a nice, I think having one of those daily routine things, again, is kind of quite a sort of simple, powerful way that maybe more for Lucy when she's older. I think even now she's sort of understanding a bit more about the little differences that we do at home compared to other families. And I think that when you're, fourth generation, they're not going to be huge things, like we're, very much, English first language, only language really that we speak, sort of very, very integrated in terms of like local community and sort of all of the sort of events, and so many things that we do are, the same as, very, very similar to sort of, the vast majority of families. But there are these little things that we do that are different, that come from, these heritage and cultural traditions that, that we're, particularly with food culture, I see that as like, that's a direct continuation, because Burmese food is just so tasty. And so it's just, it's something that has just completely carried through down the generations so far. But equally, there are these things that have been sort of introduced kind of deliberately, that we're sort of doing as because it's a living, because it's a living organic connection. And so I think that even though, some of the things that I've done with Lucy, they're not things that my granddad did with my mum and my mum did with me and that I'm doing with her, but that we're all sort of but it all connects back to our Burmese heritage and sort of wanting to connect with it. I think that those are kind of from when she was littlest, the sort of the little things that were sort of cultural and integrated from that perspective. And certainly in terms of picture books, I think that other than that I see the sun in Myanmar, I got some Buddhist picture books, some simple ones, and so that, and then we and then we've got and I do have a very old collection of Burmese folk tales. I probably didn't start, and it's beautiful. It must be from the 1930s or something. It's like so delicate. You feel a bit nervous every time you get it out. It's a beautiful little book. It's all sort of animal folk tales. And so I do have those. I probably didn't start reading those with Lucy until she was so maybe 6 or 7. So yeah, I think in terms of kind of books and stories that were sort of almost lined up. I had that book and I knew that I wanted to introduce the stories to her when she was at the right sort of age. And yeah, I think that probably it wasn't until she got to about 6 years old that we sort of started talking about it a bit. And by that point, my granddad had passed away and I was on this journey where sort of, my, it always intersects, I think, with where you're at as a parent, and how, what your relationship to your heritage is like, and how much is at the forefront of your thoughts. I think possibly it was prominent to Lucy at that sort of age, maybe at a good kind of age for her to be sort of cluing into it, because she was old enough to sort of notice and be asking questions about it, when I was, really delving into my family history. And I was, and I sort of volunteered to, take all of my granddad's photographs. I sort of took that on because he was a huge photographer, and he had like suitcases full of photos that had been completely unorganized, and papers from, and sort of little knickknacks and all sorts from when he'd been traveling, and letters to friends and family members, and that was one of the things that I sort of volunteered to take and like look through. So obviously there's a lot of different things to go through. So that was something that I took on for my mum and my aunt. And yeah, so she would sort of see me in the evenings, getting out this old suitcase full of photographs and full of letters and full of stories, and we'd have conversations about it. And I remember at one point when we bought a new doll's house for her, and her playing with her dolls, and I think I was just in the room, or next door, and there on her doll's house there were sort of a series of pictures, like family pictures, going up the stairway. I remember her taking one of her Barbies, and sort of, and she was showing, it was like there was a Barbie visitor, and they were sort of going around the house, and she was like, and these are pictures of my family, and they're from Burma.
Mm.
And I remember sort of laughing to myself and going, okay, like that, there's definitely some things going on there where she's thinking about this, and she's aware of this, and I felt quite pleased about that, because she easily could have been, I guess, completely unaware at that age, and I was glad that she wasn't. I'd sort of planted in those few little bits that meant that she had that sort of early on connection. I think the other thing that sort of really sort of shaped how she felt about her sort of Asian identity was when I took part in a documentary as part of the British East and Southeast Asian Heritage Month. So there was that was a really interesting project, actually. The project was called Raising Us, and it was all about kind of similar to this conversation. It was all about how we're parented affects how we parent our kids, like particularly in diaspora. And so yeah, when I sort of answered this survey, and they were very interested in including us as part of the documentary. So I did kind of a very long film interview, but they were also really wanted to see and sort of film and capture family life, and they interviewed they interviewed Sam as well, but he was only a toddler at the time, so it was very very little questions. But Lucy was, she found it really interesting. She loved being, we would talk, most of the film crew were from Malaysia and Singapore, mostly. They were obviously all living in the UK and had been living here for a little while, but that was their heritage. And we were sort of talking about all sorts of different things, and shared experiences. That sort of, one of those nice experiences where it's like, despite the sort of the differences on paper, there was so much similarity there, and sort of the experiences that overlapped, and sort of emotionally how you connect with each other. And we shared a meal together, and we spent the whole day together, basically, with the film crew. And I remember I've got this because they sent me some still photographs from the footage as a thank you. I've actually got one up in my study now that I'm looking at, which is a picture of Lucy sat, and she's reading the Burmese folktales book, and so she that was one of the things that she did for the filming. I don't even think that was planned. I think that was something that she talked about, and she was like, "Oh, can I read this to you?" And so then they recorded her reading one of the stories. And I think that that was a brilliant experience to I think for the outside validation. And I think that was, it was deeply healing for me as well. I think for Lucy to get that from so young, that sort of from somebody outside of our family to go, your heritage and your family's story connects with other people in the community, and you're part of this wider community of people who share similar stories or different stories that overlap in sort of particular ways. And I think that it was really a really positive experience for us all to have as a family. Had a really deep impact on me. But I'd be fascinated to hear from Lucy when she's grown up. That was a few years ago. But I think that was kind of the first time when she was of an age. She was about 7 years old then, where she's able to sort of. I think whenever there's a prompt, you don't want to be talking about it all the time, because you've got too much other sort of lovely childhood things to be getting on with in school and friendships and all of that stuff. But I think that having we had sort of the little daily things in there from when she was young, and just books around connection to food culture, and as time's gone on and I had a bit more energy, I started thinking about like what sort of like festivals and little things can we mark at home. And we do those sometimes. It's sort of, I have to admit, it really depends on my energy level, because there's not a Burmese community in Southampton where we live, so there's nothing that I sometimes I think it would be great to go up to London and sort of connect with events that are happening. We've not been yet. I would like to. But I definitely do. The one thing that I did go out of my way to do was, there was an exhibition at the British Museum. I think it was the British Museum. It was in London anyway. There was an exhibition of sort of Burmese treasures, really, treasures and artwork. It was, and that was something that I was really passionate. I really wanted to go and see it. It was on in London for a few weeks. And it was over the winter, and I sort of realised that the only date that I would be able to go up and see it was over the school Christmas holidays. So I took both Lucy and Sam with me. That was just under a year ago that we went to do that, and that was kind of specifically, we went up to London for the day just to go and see that. And obviously it was Christmas time, so I was like, we'll have a day out in London, and we did all of that. And again, I think Sam was, he was 5 years old. He was still a little bit, I think he did find it really fascinating. Sort of, I think, because you see something that is, they had these amazing, what's it called? The sort of the big dishes where they give the donations to the monasteries, and they had some really huge ones that were all made out of gold, and some incredible tapestries, and there was a whole, they had a carved chariot that was there. Huge amount of things. You see things that are just gold and sparkling, covered in rubies, and it'll impress anybody at any age. Sam loved seeing all of that stuff. Lucy, though, she wanted to read absolutely everything, which was great, and I loved that. And we had conversations about sort of everything, and talking about, it was a great into sort of talking about Burmese history, because you had sort of various artifacts from various different Burmese kings and queens, and and then they had sort of some elements as well from sort of the different tribes, and it went all the way through to The last bit of the exhibition was looking at sort of more modern history, and they even covered the coup. And we sort of, there was a video documentary that we sort of sat and watched for a few minutes, and so that was kind of, at the very end of the experiment, that was where I was like, okay, these things kind of, I can connect more directly to sort of our family history and sort of things that I know about and that have been happening. But yeah, she was. I was surprised in a way at how much focus and attention she had for it. She, I would say, was pretty much as interested as I was. She had less context, but she was fascinated, and in the end, I think I gave Sam my phone to play with and go and sort of sit in a corner, because we were reading absolutely every bit of tiny text as we were going around and having, opening up so many discussions. We were there for much longer than I thought we were going to be, considering it was just a couple of rooms, and obviously in a huge museum. We did wander around and look at some other things as well while we were there. But yeah, she had a huge appetite for it, and I think that all of those things obviously fed into, all of those experiences came before then, when she had this opportunity with brownies, and the thing comes up, and she's sort of thinking, oh, what could I do, that was then at the forefront of her mind, and that she was interested in it, and it was very much something that then she wanted to open up as a conversation and lead, and yeah, and opening up more questions. And it was interesting, and she then has had, she's been again with brownies. She had another opportunity for sort of another badge. She had to give like a presentation about a topic, and she sort of flip-flopped. It wasn't, she didn't go with it in the end, but she went through sort of a few different topics that she wanted to talk about. But one of the things that she really wanted to do at one point was she wanted to do a presentation and talk all about her family history. And so we actually started working on a presentation that went into her family history, and we were sort of taught. And I think, and it's nice, I think because we've talked about the Burmese history, she wanted to include that. It's also made her curious about the other branches of her family, and sort of and talking about sort of the contrast and what was going on in different places at the same time. Yeah, I think that children can be so fascinated in so many different things, and they can surprise you at any age, I think, in how much they want to engage. I think it's really nice for me that over the past couple of years that I'm seeing that it's definitely not just me pushing it on her. Like, she's coming to me with those questions and these opportunities, where she's obviously starting to really explore and form her identity on her own, separately from anything that I'm exposing her to. But I do think that the things that I've exposed her to have had a really big impact in shaping those things.
So I find it very interesting, like just listening to the way that you describe the different media through which you try to expose her to that heritage, because I grew up in a migrant family, and so for us, my parents went to great lengths to obtain TV shows and movies, so that in our house, like sometimes we would watch the same TV shows that our parents grew up on, and sometimes we'd be watching just local, like, Australian TV shows. So we kind of had that mixed heritage, but it's much more difficult to do that with Burmese media, especially if you don't sort of
Yeah.
speak the language. Like, my sister and I, we grew up bilingual, so we can just take books off the shelf, or read poetry or watch TV shows or whatever, and that's convenient. But with the Burmese, the barrier is so high, and because of sort of isolationism that's happened for decades and decades, and technical limitations and financial limitations in the country, like, you don't have the same type of content. You don't have the same type of media that you can just readily expose yourself to. I remember studying Burmese. This would have been back in like 2000. I don't even know, like maybe 2010 or something like that.
Yeah.
And I studied Burmese at university, and just going on YouTube trying to find like Burmese content of anything was really difficult. It was like, oh wow, like I didn't realize just how cut off the country is until you start looking for it and you start coming up with very little to show for it. So I think at the very least, you do have the picture, but I think the pictures is very important, because I was going to ask. I mean, it's impossible for anyone to know, but I was going to ask,
Mm.
like, I wonder what Myanmar looks like inside Lucy's head,
Mm. Yeah.
because I was 27 when I went there the first time, and it did not look like what I'd pictured in my head. I had a very different colonial image
Mm.
of the country. I saw more palm trees in my head, less concrete. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
And I wonder, like, just through these artifacts, through these exhibitions, through pictures, through family records and things like that, I just wonder what the image of the country is like in her head. Like,
Yeah.
what associates with Myanmar to her.
I mean, I know. I mean, I can kind of talk for myself on that point.
Mm,
That I really know that my internal images of Myanmar are very influenced by the past, I guess, because that's where that's where my family stories come from. That's where, some of the direct sort of questions that you have of like, oh, my granddad was born in this place. I wonder what this place looks like.
mm,
But a lot of the time you're looking at it at a particular time, or of course, because, anything that any of those kind of touchstones of like, oh, there was a family event at this church, for instance. I remember looking and of course, all of the buildings that you're looking at, that you maybe connect to your story, they're colonial buildings, because of course they are. And so yeah, it's kind of this funny thing, I think that, and like I know as well, like what you're saying about, just how difficult it is to find media of any kind. I think that that's something that I really suffered from, and my mum really suffered from, because there was just nothing. It was impossible. I think that we found. I remember, us going to the library and finding like one, like coffee table book of photographs. I don't think just of Burma. I think it was Southeast Asia, but I think that there
mm.
were, some, and it's just, and then it's all the sort of the very, the sort of it's all like began, and like all of those kinds of, and the
The
and the
touristy places.
yeah, the temples and the pagodas, and so yeah, and like then that influences as well, kind of your images. And I think one, and like I found like Instagram was a really powerful. When I was started wondering about, oh, I wonder, like, I just started following as many different Burmese accounts as I could, including just like regular Burmese people, and I learned a lot through that. But I still know that whatever pictures I've got in my head
Mm,
are not accurate.
mm,
But yeah, it's a funny thing from that point of view, to sort of have this connection that's so important to you. It's a story, really. I
mm,
think um, the sort of the lived experience is a diaspora experience, and a diaspora grief experience as well, definitely. Because, and a lot of that is to do with current Burmese history, about how difficult it is to access things, that
mm.
makes that direct connection just much more difficult.
It does, and I know this is something that I've referenced multiple times doing this
Mm.
podcasting, but it is every time these types of conversations come up, it just always reminds me of that line from Immortal Technique of "From now on, things can never be the same as before because the place that I'm from
Mm.
doesn't exist anymore," and it just yeah, it's as you say, the images, the source material that you have are tied to a time point.
Yeah. And
And
this is something that I've spoken to. My granddad passed away. He has siblings who are still alive, so I speak sometimes to my my great aunt and my great uncle, and I've spoken in particular to my granddad's younger brother about this on multiple times when he said, and he had several points where he really considered if he wanted to do a trip to Myanmar, and he decided not to because he said that he travelled really wild, really widely in his lifetime. He'd been to Asia multiple times. He'd always loved it, and it was but it was just at those time points when he was travelling, it wasn't considered particularly safe to go there. And then when the we had the sort of peaceful transition period of time, he considered it, and he thought, well, no, because he really, what he wanted was he wanted to go and see where his mum had grown up, and he wanted to sort of see the Burma that she knew, because
yeah,
that was the important connection to him, those stories, that connection to his mum. And he was like, but I go there, it's not gonna be there.
yeah,
It's only really alive, that kind of thing is only really alive in the imagination. And I think that then that the journey to then going to Myanmar is almost uh, a committal to forming a new additional
yes,
type of relation. I wouldn't say a different, yeah, because it doesn't change the relationship you already have, that relationship to your family stories and your family history, and that imagination sense of what it was like 80 years ago. Yeah, and it's yeah, I mean, like, you know I'm a writer. I'm writing an English historical fiction novel at the moment, which is set a few hundred years ago, and it's the same kind of thing, really. You can never time travel. It's all an
mm,
exercise in imagination. It always connects really to sort of what's going on with you right here and right now. um but yeah, but I think that sort of forging um those connections with more contemporary things, I think that that's kind of how you keep things organic, and
mm,
how you let things evolve and grow in terms of sort of relationships. And and I think that there are those examples of sort of communities, diaspora communities, that sort of they forge their own culture in a place that sort of evolves with its own history over time. And I guess maybe that's part of how one does that. And and sometimes it turns into sort of a new piece, a new unique piece of culture in that country that came from that origin.
mm.
Yeah. Or
I mean,
sometimes it does, sometimes it
this is
fades.
something that I struggle with a lot, and I think a lot of people experience what we can probably call a nostalgia for a past that you
Mm,
never actually lived in,
yeah.
and that may never have existed, and it's a very common thing. And I always struggle with it, like, oh, I don't like modernity, quote unquote, and all these new things. It's like it feels like it's
Mm,
taking us away from the past. But I I was actually impressed in the United States. Unfortunately, I can't remember. It was one of the more rural states, and they'd had a massive influx of Pacific Islander people because
mhm.
their homes are quite literally sinking under the ocean because of
Yeah.
global warming and climate change. And I was listening to this mayor of a ostensibly relatively conservative town, and what he was saying was that people are a little bit upset that you've got all these newcomers with their own language and their own culture coming in, and people are upset that the town doesn't look like it looked in the good old days.
Hmm.
But we today are building the next generation's good old days now. you
Yeah.
know this is what in 50 years, this is what people are going to go look back on and say, oh yeah, I remember when all these Pacific Islanders moved in, and those were the good old days. That's when everything was really chill and relaxed. And there's always a nostalgia for that
Mm,
youth, but it's not necessarily bad for that thing to not exist anymore.
mm,
And it's a bitter pill to swallow, I think. um but yeah, just transitioning from that, I was wondering, talking about Lucy still, her connection to her cultural heritage prior to doing this charity work is one
Mm.
thing. Has doing this charity work, has doing this advocacy opened a door for her to really revitalize that connection and form a stronger identity to that Burmese lineage, or is it still basically the same and rather just she's done a good thing for a community she feels connected to, but it doesn't sort of open those opportunities for her to really delve even deeper into that identity?
That's a really interesting question. I don't think that it's had a huge impact on her identity in terms of like connection to family, because I think that we had already opened a lot of those doors in terms of how she knew I related and sort of her place within that, and opportunities to have family stories. But I think what it gave her was a sense of agency and direct living connection that she's not
Mm,
had before.
yeah.
She's seen me do it because really the documentary project was that was me forming a different living connection to my heritage and connecting with other people. And this is her first step doing the same thing. She has done something which easily couldn't, would have, if not for her, it wouldn't have happened. And she did something that opened up, it changed, it made a change in the world, what she did.
Yeah.
And I think that had a tremendous, I think that, that kind of thing always has a tremendous impact. But I think in that intersection, where she was able to sort of read the stories of the people who, had received her donations and wanted to pass on messages, and sort of seeing all the photographs and seeing her name written on it, and seeing the sort of, the invitation of like, you should come to this area one day when you're older, and all of that
Yeah.
sort of thing. And that's really powerful. And equally, opening up that conversation with her friends, her peers at school and at Brownies, to say, oh, I'm doing this thing, to have that pride and to have that opening to be able to talk about it as well.
Mm.
Yeah.
There's a sense of like almost ownership of that
Mm.
identity when you action it, and you actually, I don't know, I feel, again, coming from that immigrant perspective, that when you grow up abroad, it's not like a problem. When I go home, it's not an issue. Like, I don't have to sort of prove my identity or anything, but there is a certain sense when you're living abroad that you almost have to take ownership. In a sense, you have to actively be your identity. It's not a
Mm.
passive thing. And
Yeah.
so doing something tangibly, like shouldering a responsibility, as it were, that comes with that identity, and fulfilling an obligation, gives you that sense of ownership, and it gives you that sense of fulfilling what is expected of you as a member of this group, as a member of this label.
Mm.
Um, so I don't know. Maybe when Lucy's older and she sort of sits and processes on back on these events, she'll have her own sort of take on the thing. But
Yeah.
time will tell. But that said, I think we've covered quite a lot here, and it's really,
Mm.
it's I think it's a really good message here, because it's not just about the power of an individual to do something and make a small change. That's one thing, but it's also this thread, the idea that the identity, the heritage, the link to a place or to a people or to an event or a circumstance can be very thin, and it can be very distant, but it's still there. And as an individual, you can sort of look within yourself and say, this problem or this struggle or this crisis, this is mine as well, and this is something that I should be invested in, and that I should care about, and that I should try to advocate for, especially because I'm far removed from it, because that gives me a lot of tools and a lot of advantages
Mm.
that the other people don't have. And I think that's a really big takeaway from this story.
Just kind of connecting really with some of the lovely metaphors that you were just saying. I think if you think about you think about that connection as a thread over time, and I think that if you don't do anything with that thread, like any kind of material, it can get thinner, or it can start to fray. It can get very fragile. And that's something that can happen, and and it is still completely a valid connection, whatever kind of connection that you have, but that you also are able to sort of see that something is getting thinner and frayer, and fraying in time, and you can repair it. You can add new threads to it to strengthen it. Or you can think about it as like a heartstring as well, that like a muscle that you exercise. And I think a lot about, and I have thought a lot about this over sort of the past like 7-8 years, about, I think that I'm really at that point now where I'm kind of aware that the every step that I take forward now into strengthening that relationship is almost turning it into a new thing. But I think that that's kind of beautiful, really. And it's a lovely thing. And it's just, I think in terms of like family connection, it's like it's a different way of remembering and grieving and loving. And don't they say that, grief is love that persists? And yeah, and that's kind of how, that's a big part of how I connect with it. And it'll be fascinating to see what it's like for for my kids, for the next generation, how it all goes on. But I think there's just always a huge appetite to continue connecting and loving, and to not get too, I think I spent a long time when I was younger worrying a lot about whether or not something was authentic enough to be validated. And I think that the older that I get, the more okay I feel about sort of innovating and creating new connections, and that's just as valid. Yeah.
Thank you for being a part of this conversation and joining our global community of listeners. Here at Insight Myanmar Podcast, we see our platform as a space where stories, reflections, and experiences come together to create deeper understanding and foster meaningful connections. Each conversation is an invitation to strengthen the ties that reveal our shared humanity, which is grounded in a sense of care towards Myanmar and its people. And this work is made possible only through the generosity and support of listeners like you. Your contributions enable us to continue amplifying these voices, sharing these important stories, and connecting us all through the power of dialogue. And so by giving, you're not just supporting a production, you're actively nurturing a growing community of insight and compassion. So if you found value in what we share, we invite you to help us sustain and expand this platform. Every donation, no matter the size, helps us to keep this effort alive. Visit insightmyanmar.org/donation to make a contribution and be a part of the shared journey.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda ba yaranamano